Hi, hello, and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. Today I wanted to explore the ideals of masculinity in Grecian times. We often think of masculinity in Greece as being monolithic. We think of strong, powerful, Spartan-like adenoses who will fight for their cause. However, this is not a universal representation of masculinity in Greece. Rather than it being a fixed concept, the concept of manliness is fluid, sometimes contradictory and untenable. Competing constructions of masculinity in ancient Greece by Scott Rubath summarises it well. During the 5th century, Athenians and Spartans were two of the most powerful political powers in Greece. They were often seen in contrasting and competing ways to be Greek. The Athenians were presented as individualistic, capitalistic, pragmatic, greedy, and perhaps ambitious. Athens was a place to go for comfort, progressive ideas, luxury, and wealth. In contrast, Sparta was more rural, a collection of small villages with little interest in civic infrastructure or material culture. Sparta was a primarily land-based, military society with little interest in commercial development. Its value system prioritised the collective over the individual, and discipline and tradition over innovation and self-expression. They lacked coinage, making acquisition of wealth more difficult, and developed a highly intrusive constitution that became the model for several early utopian political theories. Politically and socially, Sparta was conservative, slow to act and slow to speak. Athens, on the other hand, was a radical democracy. Every male citizen was expected to vote, serve on juries, and participate directly in the running of the state. Individualism and free thinking were, if not always encouraged, at least tolerated in most instances. In contrast to Sparta, which was wary of tourists and strangers, Athens claimed to be an open society, an exemplar for all Greece. The final perspective that we will examine is that of the ancient Stoics. The Stoa was founded in Athens by Zeno of Citium in the 4th century BCE and remained centred in Athens until the 2nd century BTE. The Stoics bring in a non-status, philosophical perspective that internalises masculinity. It will not surprise you if you've ever been to any museum ever that the Greeks worshipped the male form. The ideal image of a man comes from the Homeric legends and today forms the basis of our ideals about masculinity, and not just in the physical form, but also in strength, physical skills, bravery and brawn. These modern stereotypes and ideals come from a need to survive, in the wild and in war. For Spartan soldiers, for example, any man who acted in a cowardly way in the field of battle would be, in the best case scenario, lose his citizenship, and at worst be humiliated so badly that many would end their lives. In literature, there is some more variety in how masculinity is portrayed in ancient Greece. We do get masculinity portrayed as prowess, courage, brutality, and physical superiority in stories like Achilles, Hercules, and Ajax. But in Odyssey and Thinking, we also get heroes showing their masculinity through cunning, wisdom, strategic thinking, and giving good advice. Both types of stories were popular through Athens' golden age and are seeing a resurgence today after a suspected waning in the 18th and 19th century. There are a number of different theories about masculinity in Grecian times. The first is that masculinity is a sliding scale. Men in this period faced a higher standard of beauty and perfection than women. But with that being said, women's bodies were considered disfigured versions of men's. In Greece, to be born a man was not enough to make you masculine. This was to be earned. The understanding of biological sex was quite different to today, with female and male reproductive organs thought to be essentially the same, but just in different places. The male body was then seen as the norm and the standard, and the height of perfection. Female reproductive organs were inverted, hidden, and thus imperfect. To Thomas Lacker, this is described as the one-sex model. The two sexes were not considered the opposite of each other, but delicate, difficult-to-read shadings of one sex. Females and males were not considered opposites, but more or less perfect versions of the male body. There could be masculine women and effeminate men, and men had to actively strive to eradicate any traces of softness. Professor Paul Cartledge from the University of Cambridge, the leading authority in ancient Greece, explains, "One was not born a man in ancient Greece. One achieved or retained or lost manly status. And in Sparta, where warfare meant more culturally than it did in Athens, one did so by proving themselves in battle. As man was the standard, virtues were considered masculine characteristics. Plutarch describes the ideal woman as displaying masculine qualities, strength, bravery, and rationality, whereas women stereotypically were seen to be weak, vindictive, and self-indulgent, susceptible to falling to their emotions. Ideals of masculinity were further divided. For Athenians, the brute force and veracity of the Spartans still raised some eyebrows. For Spartan families, loyalty to the state was the most important virtue. The army was the home and the extended family. Marriage was important for producing future soldiers, delayed marriage was shamed, and women were the head of the household in the absence of their man. They enjoyed more freedoms, not under the thumb of their husband, as much in other areas. With paternal rights and responsibilities diminished, women were also managing the household finances and operating businesses. Aristotle himself was not impressed by this, believing in nature that men could rule over women, and pointed out with bemusement the opposite result in Sparta. Professor Cartledge highlights this point further. Unlike Athenian women, Spartan adult women could both own and dispose of private land. Spartan men did not consider that a diminution of their masculinity, as perhaps Athenian men would have. Despite the apparent freedoms enjoyed by Spartan adult women in contrast to Athenian women, it is still masculine because martial values ruled the society and polity as a whole. Men retained the upper hand. In the Theban special forces, men in the military were encouraged to be intimate with one another, in the belief that this would deepen the bond between soldiers and make them fight more effectively. They formed in the 4th century BC a contingent of 150 couples called the Gay 300, who fought on the front lines and had the responsibility of ending the dominance of Spartans in their territory. For Greeks, they were quite liberal in their sexuality. There was no shame in seeking out sex workers in extramarital affairs and in being with other men, as masculinity was divine, especially in some periods, especially if the man was a boy. Being active in these dynamics was tantamount to being perceived as masculine, however, as being submissive was thought to have been the woman's part. Despite this, sex was still used to humiliate and denounce. In Athens, being politically active was a masculine trait. Freedom of speech was inherently a masculine freedom, not extended to women, and so all men over the age of 18 were expected to attend community meetings and vote on matters. Aristotle himself believed that men were political animals who could and would not survive alone. Stoic masculinity shares many similarities with the Spartan ideal and many significant differences as well. Both Spartans and Stoics saw life as a continuing act of training. They agreed that the object of life's energies and ambitions are not external goods such as property, family, wealth, or even reputation. The goal is to transform the person, for the Spartan into the best possible soldier, for the Stoic into the sage. The Stoic held that all the virtues are interconnected and unified, and that it is impossible to possess any virtue without possessing all virtues. The result was that the Stoic cultivated virtues that both harden the body and sharpen the mind. The Athenians, of course, cultivated virtues. Athenians of military age trained for warfare, and prominent Athenian politicians trained in rhetoric. To head a household effectively, one needed to develop skills and expertise associated with one's given profession. However, for Athenians, these excellences tend to be valued primarily for the sake of externals, such as wealth, security, and respect, and status in society. In short, the Stoic and Spartan trained to be a certain sort of individual. The Athenian trained in order to have certain benefits. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. It's interesting to see how different forms and ideals of masculinity have developed. It seems deeply interconnected with the culture and community a person finds themselves in, and also has some universal themes that thread it all together. And if you like this episode, give us a like and subscribe for more. I bring out new episodes every Tuesday.